So, where did we end in the last session? The last time we met, what were we talking about?
We were discussing Meenakshi Mukherjee's essay, and we were discussing novel purpose.
Okay, what did we discuss about Meenakshi Mukherjee? What kind of things were she talking about Indian English fiction? Go back to your notes and tell me.
She talks about Indian fiction in English as breaking away from the British legacy. I mean, it's not something that the British have left us
Yes.
to take up and continue.
Right.
More in the sense of finding a reconciliation between Indian system of values.
Yes, very good. This point lies at the heart of Meenakshi Mukherjee's discussion, because Mehrotra and many others, they were talking about Indian English writing as an offshoot of colonial modernity, as an offshoot of a legacy that the British had left behind. So, Mukherjee is telling us that it is also important to look at it as a native tradition, to take into account the various other cultural impulses which were at work, to look at the ways in which it also reflects some of the traditional narratives. Yeah, she's not really saying taking a very nativist position and disregarding the colonial legacy, but she is arguing for the need to have a fresh kind of historical approach towards Indian fiction and Indian novel itself. And in the next few sessions, in fact, even when we are discussing today, and also in the discussions that you would be doing as part of individual novels, you will find that you will be time and again going back to Meenakshi Mukherjee, because from the 70s, one could even say till the year she died, there is a way in which she had been continually contributing to the history, the criticism of Indian writing in English. And when we talk about the scholarship which is associated with Indian fiction in English, it is difficult to overlook many things that she said, because either most of the traditions, most of the criticisms which came after, it was all either in some way they were taking off from what Meenakshi Mukherjee spoke about, or they were departing in significant ways away from what she said. So, she would be informing most of our discussions for a while, and we would also note that many of the important things which are of significant concern for Indian writing in English, particularly Indian fiction in English, Meenakshi Mukherjee had always had something or the other to say about it. So, today we are focusing on two essays. This is first one is Pilgrim Prose and the Novel of Purpose. This is from Meenakshi Mukherjee's work Realism and Reality, and also on this chapter on the beginnings of the Indian novel. This is from Mehrotra's Literary History. So, just to also give you a sense of how Meenakshi Mukherjee's readings can also be looked at from an alternate point of view, particularly from the point of view of Dalit writing and the perspective of caste. We also take a very brief look at Dilip Menon's essay, A Place Elsewhere, lower caste Malayalam novels of the 19th century, and this is from his own book Blindness of Insight, which came out in 2006. Yeah. So, why are we looking at Meenakshi Mukherjee again? Why are we talking about certain historical sense again, though because as you know, we started talking about the need to historically situate Indian fiction in English. This is the 4th or 5th class that we are having, again talking about the need to situate it historically, because it is also important to what Meenakshi Mukherjee does is, she is trying to look at it from the point of view of a historian. She is trying to locate Indian writing in English and Indian novel in general in a very historical way. She is trying to situate it in a historical way, but at the same time, she is also responsible for foregrounding certain conceptual and theoretical frameworks which could be used in the study of Indian English novel, and those frameworks, quite surprisingly and very interestingly, they continue to remain as a dominant framework. You can only depart from the frameworks that Meenakshi Mukherjee had put forward. And it also talks about the beginnings, the trajectory and the development of novel, because there was a general sense that all of these were the products of colonial modernity. But she undertakes a more detailed task of situating the origins and how certain moments can be identified as more apt beginnings than the other. So, those are the specific things that she goes on to do. And in this is the second chapter of her work Realism and Reality, and here she talks about how development of novel is again an indirect result of the spread of English education and a consequent exposure to Victorian literature. And here, what is more important is that she is not focusing on the event of the minutes. She is not focusing on the say the colonial enterprise as the only force or the prime force behind the production of these sorts of writings. Which is why she talks about the indirect result of the spread of English education and a consequent exposure to Victorian literature. And she is talking about a range of other things which shaped the prose in English. She is not talking about the novelistic enterprises per se. She is taking us through a historical journey through a range of colonial enterprises, such as the establishment of the Serampore Mission Press, the translation of the Bible, which she also identifies as a very significant event. But the missionary enterprise, which also had a commendable support from the administrative side, she talks about it with a bit of a skepticism as well, because she thinks the prose which came into being, the prose in English as well as the prose in the vernacular languages, which came into effect after the translations of Bible and many other Christian literature into different languages. She says those sort of works perhaps had a very questionable literary value, and these notions about the secular prose and the religious prose and how she differentiates one from the other, this in fact has also had a lot of bearing on the way in which we talk about good literature and bad literature. We talk about whether certain works are literary or non-literary. In fact, Dilip Menon's work also comes into plays an important role in this context, because he says maybe whenever she is talking about religion, it was not entirely about religion, it was also about caste. Yeah. So, Dilip Menon also wonders, Dilip Menon is not really in dialogue with Meenakshi Mukherjee, but there is a way in which we can bring both the texts together. But Dilip Menon and Ajanta Sarkar, some of those people that we shall be taking a look at a later point, Gauri Vishwanathan, so they all feel that by relegating these two say camps, secular literature and religious literature. Yeah, and religious literature here also meant predominantly Christian literature, because those were also the kind of writings. She talks about Christianity's contribution, particularly when she talks about religious literature, and she talks about fiction written by Christians, either original Christians or the Christians who convert, or the natives who converted into Christianity in the mid 1900s. So here when she talks about these novels, and these are all in fact novelists who wrote both in English and as well as some of them only in their native languages, in Bengali, and Mrs. Collins was a missionary based in Kerala, and she is supposedly said to have written the first ever novel which came out in Kerala, but it was also written in English. But there is very little scholarly or critical attention on that. Maybe it is primarily because of the way in which Meenakshi Mukherjee identifies the existence of these works, talks about them, and also categorically says that those are not, their literary value is very questionable, and those are not really secular prose literature that you can engage with. Based on her evaluation, in fact, you can also take a look at one of the things that she says, it's also part of the course material that I have given. Meenakshi Mukherjee says in the last 30 years there has been only 300 converts, of whom 200 were Parayas. Seen as a whole in the 19th century, the spread of Christianity in India was not a central event socially or culturally. The literary byproducts of missionary activities also turn out to be minor works, contributing only indirectly to the evolution of novel in India. But the tributaries are important in understanding the mainstream. She is being quite right from the perspective of a historian, saying these are only tributaries, those are not like major forces at work. But the way in which one can't really say dismiss, the way in which she marginalizes certain literary products in comparison to other kinds of writings, that has been seen as a bit problematic by Dilip Menon and also by Ajanta Sarkar. Those are also some of the essays that we shall be taking a look at a later point, when we particularly talk about caste in the context of again Untouchable and God of Small Things. So one of the arguments that Dilip Menon puts forward is that there is a need for looking at modernity from a historical as well as a contextual point of view, which is why he says these set of novels, we will not go through the details of those, which Meenakshi Mukherjee quite, she gives us quite a detailed description of those individual works which were produced in different languages and mostly by converts or and in some of the cases even by wives of the missionaries. Yeah. So, and Dilip Menon feels that these novels cannot be perhaps seen as written by Christians or converts. Maybe there is a caste element which is taken as merely as an incidental fact, and she talks about how there are certain works produced in 19th century in Malayalam in Kerala where religion, conversion to Christianity is not perhaps the dominant thing. Maybe it is about the experience of slave caste. And he also wonders whether it becomes convenient for dominant literary critical methods to relegate these aspects into religion and then thereby gloss over the aspects of caste. And he also talks about how these set of novels which Meenakshi Mukherjee puts in the category of Christian novels, thereby not secular prose. Dilip Menon wonders whether they in fact are encouraging us to go about with an exploration of a subaltern imaginary that is excluded from the novels written by the dominant caste of Nayars at this historical moment. He is also doing a comparative study between the other kinds of novels which were emerging from Kerala written in Malayalam during the same period of time, during the same time when colonial modernity was taking root in Kerala. And Gauri Vishwanathan's work, its Masks of Conquest, that also draws attention to the distortions of colonial modernity. So, in a way it's a feat that Meenakshi Mukherjee achieves to trying to situate the historicity of Indian novel away from only the clutches of colonial modernity. But Dilip Menon, Gauri Vishwanathan, Ajanta Sarkar, critics like them, they go a step further and they also engage with the distorted ways in which colonial modernity had been theorized, the distorted ways in which colonial modernity was being talked about. So, having said that, though we have to be attentive, alert to the rereadings that even Mukherjee's work is possible of, the rereadings that we have to undertake of Mukherjee's works if we were to analyze Indian fiction in English. There are certain significances associated with the frameworks that Mukherjee gives us. She tells us how to analyze Indian fiction as a colonial as well as a native product, and she also encourages us to be attentive to the difficulties and challenges inherent. For example, these are the difficulties that she talks about: how to make sense of modernity, Western tradition and native worldviews, and how to process all of them together in this new form of narrative which is available to us, how to engage with the internal difficulties that one have as well as the external ways in which one is dealing with it. So, I reiterate, one of the important things that Meenakshi Mukherjee does is to situate the historicity of the genre and also locate a particular literary tradition. This term is very important. If you recall the many discussions that you had in the context of think of a range of other courses that you had done, there is always a literary tradition in place. But this being in the sense that there is a way in which you talk about particular authors, either in terms of how they continue the literary tradition, how they depart from the literary tradition. That is how we even demarcate different literary ages. But here when we look at Indian writing in English, it is just like one seamless sea. It is difficult to see where the demarcations are, particularly in the earlier phases when you talk about it. It all looks as if it is all different byproducts of the colonial modernity. So, what Meenakshi Mukherjee does is, she tells us how you can trace a particular literary tradition even in that. So, those initial moments of those initial moves which are important both for literary history as well as for developing a critical enterprise. Both of these things are being done through Meenakshi Mukherjee's works. And she is also giving up, this is very important, she is setting up yardsticks for reading and evaluation, which is why even today when we look at certain kinds of work, we just begin to wonder whether this is like purely based on certain kinds of experiences. Is it secular enough to be included? Are there certain difficulties if you include this kind of writing? Will it totally beat the purposes of modernity? Will it totally be it the purposes of say the new kind of prose that we are being used with. Maybe from this yardstick, yeah, looking at literature, particularly Indian fiction in English, from this kind of a yardstick, you also, you know, when we talk about particular texts, the base in which certain kinds of writers have always been privileged over the others. Yeah, maybe that's a time when you also have to revisit some of Mukherjee's postulations and see whether those yardsticks worked in particular ways, in exclusion, in inclusion. Yeah, for example, when she talks about the importance of secular criticism, it also means ignoring the aspects of religion and caste. It is I'm not saying that's a very say deliberate thing that she is doing. Maybe this happens inadvertently as a result of employing certain kinds of critical practices, but our task is also to be alert to how it works unknowingly or inadvertently. And this focus on the literary prose. For this, you know, we can't really say it's all Meenakshi Mukherjee's fault. Even otherwise, certain kinds of assumptions are there about what is literature and what is not. Yeah? And if you look at Indian writing in English, Indian fiction particularly, there has been very little experiment except by way of certain ways in which Rushdie has employed language, or there is one novel in verse. Which is that one? There is a novel written in verse by one of the leading Indian English writers. Yeah, that is also one of the recent ones, very well acclaimed novel written in verse. Find that out. Yeah. So there have been very little experiments on that account because there is a set way in which the literary has been evaluated, the literary has been understood. And yeah, there also again you can say, except for these exceptions, whoever has dared to experiment in some form or the other, they have either not really made it to the canon, or they have suffered heavily in the hands of the market. So that aside, this is the other essay that again Meenakshi Mukherjee had written. This was part of the literary history that Mehrotra had brought out. So this is again not to say that Meenakshi Mukherjee needs to be blamed for everything that went wrong with Indian writing in English. Yeah, she is very, very important in beginning such an enterprise. And when she started talking about Indian fiction, nobody was talking about Indian fiction. When she first did her dissertation on Indian fiction in English, that was not even seen as a body of writing that could be accessed scholarly. It was just some sort of a writing which existed, and Sahitya Academy had just begun to acknowledge that kind of writing by giving awards to Indian English writers as well. But beyond that, it was not seen as a body of writing which befitted any kind of scholarly attention. She was the one who radically changed that. But now we know that if you take the kind of literary productions in our country and the secondary material which is produced alongside, Indian English fiction, perhaps it ranks the highest in that sense in terms of churning out material. If you look at the number of conferences which are being held where Indian fiction in English gets talked about. So everything has changed radically in a very short span of time from the time she started writing, which is from the 70s onwards. Of course, in the 80s the market forces also aided, but if you look at it from a purely literary critical perspective, her role is tremendous. And in fact, I am not even exaggerating when I tell you that if you want to undertake a survey of Indian fiction in English, it's difficult not to encounter Meenakshi Mukherjee every now and then. Yeah, no matter how you do your search. Yeah, it will all narrow down to either her realism and reality, or her collection of essays, Perishable Empire, or in those essays that she published individually in different forums. And when she talks about the beginning of the Indian novel, in fact she is actually focusing on Indian novel in English, and like many others who came after her, before her, 1930s is acknowledged as a decade, the takeoff decade for Indian novel in English. And what was particularly important of the 1930s, if you think about the Indian history? Please, Indians, please respond. Yeah, specific things. Other than that,
Nationalist
1930s.
Nationalist movement.
Nationalist movement, yeah.
Civil district.
Nationalist movement, then Gandhi arrives, yeah. The nationalist movement takes a very different import altogether from the end of 1920s, 1930s, and 1940s. What happens? What happened in 1947? Yeah, such a laughable thing happened. Okay, yes. So, in the 1930s, in fact, is very, very important for the Indian history. And when we start talking about the Indian writing in English in general, again, 1930s is seen as a take-off decade. There is a problem in situating 1930s as a take-off decade, because we also have a mental image of 1930s becoming the starting point, and we also tend to ignore and marginalize all those efforts, all those literary efforts which came prior to that moment. And again, though Meenakshi Mukherjee, she does a very fantastic job of tracing the historic trajectory and the intellectual traditions which were part of Indian novel from the 1930s onwards. She also takes us back to the previous century, but we know that right from the beginning, her objective is to show that 1930s is the take-off moment. Yeah, there are many things happen. She tells us there are many things which happen. She says, the genealogy can be traced to the previous century, and she also gives a detailed account of many texts perhaps she herself unearthed for the first time, because many texts had gone out of print. She talks about the difficulty in accessing them. But regardless of all of that, she comes back to this point that yes, all of those things are there, but 1930s is very important. If you again look at the way this course is structured, yeah, we begin our actual discussion only with Kantapura, yeah, regardless of the history which is over there, because that's the way canonically it has been structured. Many things may have happened prior to that moment, but we begin with Gandhi, we begin with Kantapura, we begin with how the Indian fiction responds to the nationalism moment in particular ways. And the two novels that we talk about in between from the 19th century, Kailash Chandra Dutt and Shoshi Chandra Dutt, those are about imaginary insurrections. Yeah? So, unless you have a dialogue with the colonial power, unless you have a story to tell which also runs parallel to the political mode of the nation, it's not it's not worth telling. Meenakshi Mukherjee also talks about a number of other texts as well, but they are clearly the other texts. Many of them are not available, some of them are, there's absolutely no kind of scholarly attention which has been paid on them. We would shortly see as well. And she talks about how from the beginning, novels were produced from both metropolitan centers and small towns, and she draws her attention to the specific kind of titles that those novels had. She talks about the eagerness in those titles, and she also talks about this thing that how the early writers in English, they suffer from an uncertainty about an audience. And she also says at later point in her work that this sense of an audience makes a radical difference between the earlier writers and the writers in the contemporary, that the contemporary writers are more sure of their audience. It's again a debatable thing about how to locate your readership and whether one can ever be sure of the kind of readership when you are sending out your work to a global audience. And she talks about these different debates and contestations and the vernacular traditions. But she talks about these different traditions vying for the first prize, which is the first novel ever written in India. So those sort of contestations are there. And when she begins to particularly trace the trajectory, she says the objective is to dispel the general amnesia about these predecessors. And more than that, she does not, and this comes towards the end of the essay. In fact, when she talks about the general amnesia about these predecessors, her task is not to say that the novels which came in the previous century were superior to the ones which were produced in the 1930s, but to show that we should not pretend that there was no novel at all. Yeah, she's not trying to privilege them over the other kinds of writings available in the post-1930s in any way. And she also, just like we have noticed with Mehrotra's introduction and also the brief discussions in the other works, she also talks about these two pre-novel narratives which came out in 1835 and 1845. Those are about imaginary insurrections, based on a projected future where the British also are forced to say move away from their colonial enterprise. And in this pre-novel narrative era, she talks about, how there are no generic expectations, there is no over dependence on any canonical literary text from the West. We do not see these early writers imitating them blindly, and she also says they are not weighed on by abject servility. So, those points she just glosses over, but they are very important in the sense that right from the beginning it was not as if though all of these novelistic traditions were an offshoot of colonial modernity, it did not begin with the sense of servility or with a sense of blind imitation. And she talks about how those works were also politically radical, but she says that radicalism was of a simplistic variety. So, later when we talk about the politics which is part of Indian fiction in English, maybe we would also begin to see that any kind of uprising which was which came into being before 1857. What happened in 1857? Yeah, it's also the Sepoy mutiny or whatever is known as the first war of independence, the first struggle for independence that happened in 1857. And usually we see that there is a tendency to see whatever happened before 1857 as as some kind of a politics of some kind of a radicalism of a simplistic variety, and again whatever happened before the 1930s or before Indian National Congress was officially formed, that is the end of the 19th century. So, we begin to see that those sort of movements, even the politically consolidated movements prior to the formation of Indian National Congress, prior to the arrival of Gandhi, prior to the 1857 revolts, those are not seen as organized revolts, those are not taken very seriously. Also drawing your attention to subaltern studies, I hope you must have heard of this term in the context of post-coloniality. One of the most important objectives of the subaltern historians is to take our attention away from this dominant nationalist historiography, drawing our attention to the many kinds of insurrections, revolts, the peasant revolts, which were all part of India's struggle for freedom, which were not always associated with the Indian National Congress, which were not organized, mobilized by Gandhi or such similar figures. So, here we find a way in which Meenakshi Mukherjee and all the other dominant critics, they are treading a path which runs parallel to the nationalist historiography. Which is why when some of the even Rushdie, when he begins to talk about moving away from the dominant story of the nation, we know that he strays only to a certain point. Again, there is a limit to the ways in which he strays. And many others, particularly the Dalit historians and the feminist historians, they all had a problem with the kind of alternatives which were available even when one was retelling the story, because the dominant mode, the dominant acceptable mode was the nationalist way of talking about history, the nationalist way about talking about politics. And that said, she draws her attention to these two figures as well, Lal Bihari Dey and Kripabai Satyanandan. Kripabai Satyanandan is one of the earliest women writers, and Meenakshi Mukherjee has also worked extensively on her. And she very briefly draws her attention to how some of these writers who were fluent in writing in English, and A. Madhavaya is a writer who wrote both in Tamil and in English, and how they also flaunted the kind of subjection that they felt under the British rule. And this is what she writes: with kind treatment, the Indian will remain a British subject for years to come. For the matter of that, he will remain so probably after any treatment, but he will show pleasure and pride in being so if treated kindly. So, we also find she also talks about A. Madhavaya as a representative of this kind of an attitude, who are happy to be under a benevolent colonial rule. And this is not something that we can isolate and talk about, because if you remember the rhetoric used in Srinivasa Iyengar's work, that was also a kind of pleasure and pride in the benevolent aspect of colonialism. So, we also see another paradox over here. If you go back to the other slide, here she talks about the earlier works. There is no dependence on canonical literary texts, not weighed on by abject servility. Maybe in their novelistic narrative enterprises that is not very evident. They are willing to move away as a different literary tradition altogether. But when it comes to the kind of politics that they foreground, the kind of politics that they accept here, maybe there is a sense of pleasure and pride, because I have not read through any of the works that Meenakshi Mukherjee talks about. She is maybe we can say that she does not give a number of details to prove this point, but we cannot say this is an entirely an isolated point, because we do find corollaries in certain other writings and writers as well. Mostly this essay talks about a number of details related to the text produced before 1930s, in the previous century. And the other major theme in this that she talks about is the ambivalence between tradition and modernity. And in her own words, if an ambivalence about Western civilization on the one hand is liberating and on the other as a threat to Hindu identity, continue to mark these early English novels written mainly by Hindu male upper caste writers, that's seen as a very incidental thing over here, which gets problematized in later when Ajanta Sarkar, Gauri Vishwanathan and they all start talking about it. There was, however, nothing ambiguous about their attitude to the Muslim whom the British had displaced as rulers. So, we begin to see different kinds of politics at work. It is not that these Indian English writers were only anti-colonial. There were also certain other internal kinds of disputes. Seeing it's not about seeing only the British or the colonial enterprise as the enemy figure. It was also about locating an other in terms of religion, in terms of caste. And she here, she makes this incidental reference to how most of these writers were Hindu male upper caste writers, but the radical opposition is drawn, say, only between Hindu and Muslim. Gender and caste are seen as incidental categories over here. They just happen to be male, they just happen to be upper caste, but the same sort of other figure, the same sort, if not an enemy figure, the same sort of an other figure perhaps can be located in the female subject, in woman, as well as in the other castes, castes which are lower in terms of hierarchy. So, these things Indian, not just the critical enterprise, even Indian fiction in English in general, it was not alert to many of these things for a very, very long time. Even today, when we talk about caste, and if you would like to do a presentation on caste in Indian English novel, suddenly you realize that you really don't have a choice. You have to either talk about Untouchable, or then you come back and talk about Arundhati Roy's God of Small Things. It's as if you can talk about caste only if there is a lower caste figure. Those are the only discussions which in the space of Indian fiction in English had been allowing. It's not as if caste is otherwise entirely absent. In Kantabura, there is a predominant presence of the upper caste politics, the upper caste tradition, the upper caste ethos, but that is not seen as caste. That's an incidental presence, that is part of tradition, that is part of the nation. But you can talk about caste if the caste tag does not have any of those secular markers. It's difficult to talk about caste, all the more difficult in this space because it uses the language of modernity. It's written in English. English is a modern language. It's the space that modernity inhabits so powerfully. So, from where can all of these elements of religion and caste can come? So, these are again certain questions which the earlier critical tradition of Indian writing in English had refused to deal with. I am not saying now the scene is entirely different, but at least there are a handful of people who are drawing our attention to these many ambivalences which are present. And she also talks about how many of these writers felt that the Hindu civilization can be projected as a superior one as opposed to the ineffectuality of the West. And this she does not really press this point much, but one can always assume that this sort of attitude was very prevalent because it was also going parallel, it was also in tandem with the anti-colonial agenda that nationalist movement had. Then talking about the writers in English and other languages, she can comes to this point which has been reiterated in various other phases by Meenakshi Mukherjee herself, that writers who are writing in English as well as in the other languages, both were products of the same educational system, and the only difference was that the Indian English writers, they sort of displayed their knowledge of the Western literature more obviously than the others. And she particularly talks about this case of Bankim Chandra Chattopadhyay, who wrote the first English novel Rajmohan's Wife, but after that he never wrote again in English for the reasons of nationalist fervor related to questions of nationalist loyalty and all. He shifts from Bengali to English, and she also tells us about the need to ask questions related to this choice more pertinently in the contemporary, and briefly talks about Lal Behari Day as well, one of the earlier writers. And if you still have not asked this question about where are the women in all of these discussions, given that the nationalist movement also spoke about the women in various ways. It was not as if Gandhian politics did not address women. It's a different thing whether he addressed women and Dalits in a different political framework altogether, but it was not as if women were entirely absent. Yeah, a lot of reform movements were taking place. Women were always part of the nationalist project as well. They also wanted to talk about women's education, so on and so forth. But when we talk about the history of Indian writing in English, there is a very conspicuous absence of women. Even if you talk about the contemporary women writers, maybe occasionally there are certain writers that you can flag and show. Yeah, there is one Arundhati Rai, one Kiran Desai. Other than that, yeah, we do not find a formidable presence of a set of women writers. Just like we can talk about the triumvirate of the 1930s, or the the Rushdis and the Seths and the Ghoshs of the contemporary. Yeah, so which is why she talks about Kripabai Satyanandan and talks about this writer who lived from 1862 to 1894, and she tells us that the interest in Kripabai Satyanandan is not merely of an archival interest. We also need to engage with her work for knowing what kind of presence gender had, how gender was also a part of all of these discussions. And these were the two major works that she published. 1894, Kamala, A Story of Hindu Life, and in 1895, that was after her death, Saguna, A Story of Native Christian Life was published. The second one was considered largely autobiographical, which also entails that she belonged to a family of converts. And her work was reprinted only in 1998. So, there is no surprise that no scholarly attention, no considerable scholarly attention was given to her work, and 1998 is a fairly late moment to talk about many things that happened in the previous century. And this is also the time, 1990s is also the time when renewed interest is being given to women writers. There is a lot of work which goes on to as part of literary history to dig up old writers and talk about them. If you are aware of the entire set of works that Susi Taru brought out, Women Writing India, an entire volume of women writers starting from 600 BC onwards. All of those moments, the big moments in India's literary history happens in the 1990s. Maybe this is also a part of that ongoing movement which was gaining momentum. She very briefly talks about gender in Kripa Satyanandan's novels, and there is also an entire essay that she wrote in Perishable Empire, Meenakshi Mukherjee, Ambiguous Discourse, the novels of Kripa Satyanandan, which is also part of your course material. She says that these works are of supreme importance, but even today we do not find much of a scholarly attention or much of a canonical interest in Kripa Satyanandan's novels. Her novels concerned with many things that the novels of those times were not talking about: gender, caste, ethnicity, cultural identity, yeah? And also very importantly the predicament of women who resisted being cast in the standard mold of domesticity. Her life was also very radical in that sense, and Meenakshi Mukherjee feels maybe in her we can also find the earliest articulations of feminist and cultural concerns in English by Indian women. But apart from this very brief discussions, we do not get to know more about Kripa Satyanandan's work in any of the other writers' works, and some of the things that she talks about her novels in this essay Ambiguous Discourse. She does not fit the assumptions of patriarchy, that women should be either passive objects of pleasure and convenience or creatures intriguing for domestic power. And her work was also different in the sense that it explored the debates which were inherent in the relationship between Christianity and Indian nationalism, because otherwise most of the discussions were about the traditional Hinduism, the traditional practices which were inherent to India, and the Western penetrations of modernity. So here is one writer, the two of women, talking about the ambiguous relationship between Christianity and Indian nationalism. And again going to Meenakshi Mukherjee's words, her work suggested different ways of reading, which may not be neatly confined in the simple binary grid of tradition modernity or individualism collective identity, the grids through which 19th century India has generally been studied. That's a typo. Yeah. So, at some level, even if you look at the works of the 20th century, yeah, these binaries are still there. Yeah. So, when you talk about the early nationalist phase and the writings which came out during that time, the writings of the 1930s and 40s, there is a tendency to again fit the discussion into this grid of tradition modernity, or like the individualism collective identity debate which is going on. So, like Meenakshi Mukherjee says, it is not something which could be relegated to the previous century, to the 19th century, but the critical imports of that, it continue to live on in certain ways. Yeah. So, what are the implications of these kinds of writing? She sums up with that. The tentativeness of the 19th century novel is not only about writing in an acquired colonial language, but also about their readership. Has been replaced by an overwhelming confidence among post-colonial writers that the English language belongs to them as much as to anyone else. A text written in a global language has potentially a global constituency, and therefore, as a corollary, a national one too. Yeah. So, here she is also making a statement which would help us to see the ways in which Indian fiction in English has evolved, given the limited ways in which it emerged in the previous century. Now, there is a wider readership, and there is also a way in which more confidence is there in their writing, and this has become both a global as well as a national site. And she ends by talking about the aspect of switching languages and how we need to enter into those debates. And with she draws attention to this context where Bankim Chandra had to shift from English to his Bengali mother tongue, and she says those complex circumstances which led a writer to switch to a different language in order to one was for his own personal conviction, and secondly to attain a certain recognition as a national writer. Yeah, so he had to switch the languages. What did it really entail? And in the 20th century, the process is somewhat reverse. In order to get attention as a national writer, because again in the previous session we very briefly mentioned about Ejaz Ahmed, who said that every national document, their document gets national attention or a national stature only when it is published in English, because English has become the official language, English has become the language of authority, a language of legitimacy. So, the reverse process, Meenakshi Mukherjee says, has happened from 19th to the 20th century, and one would expect many writers wanting to write in English to get that kind of recognition and that kind of wider audience. And she says, using this example, that it is important to look at not just literary issues, but to look at how it is all informed by cultural politics and market forces. So, this is something that I want to end with. In many discussions, even the canonical dominant discussions about Indian writing in English, Indian fiction particularly, you would see that there is very limited sort of kind of works which have come out looking at only at the literary aspects, looking only at the stylistic aspects. Yeah, a lot of works have emerged, the secondary material on the existing works. It talks about the cultural politics as well as the market forces. So, it is not a new thing in Indian writing in English, to talk about the literary, the cultural and the political, the market forces, all of those together, because this is how right from the time the discussions about Indian writing in English emerged. Yeah, it was not about the narrative aspects, it was not about the aspects of the text, what kind of language was used, yeah, what kind of techniques were used. Yeah. So, those things, even in the extensive discussions that Meenakshi Mukherjee had, we are not really invited to pay attention to the aspects of genre, the aspects of techniques, the stylistic devices being used. We are in fact time and again drawn to these aspects of cultural politics, how the market forces are at work, how say the nationalist versus the colonial gets projected, so on and so forth. So, this sort of a tendency you would see continually, maybe occasionally you would find certain kinds of works drawing attention to the way Rushdie uses language or Arundhati Roy uses language, but that is also seen as a post-colonial tool to speak back to the empire. Yeah. So, to sum up, it would not be wrong to say that Meenakshi Mukherjee had laid the foundations of the critical approaches towards Indian fiction in English, but nevertheless there are also the others who have shown the ways in which you can depart from those. So, when you make your presentations also, see if you do not have to always make a reference to Meenakshi Mukherjee, but see how Mukherjee or the dominant historians or the critics have already given you a framework within which you can talk about those works, and how important it becomes to move away, and how impossible also it becomes to move away in order to produce a new kind of reading altogether. Yeah. But nevertheless, you know, what I want you to keep in mind is that the framework that now we take for granted to talk about the tradition of Indian fiction in English, or the the intellectual trajectory of Indian fiction in English, that was, there were certain pioneers who had to painstakingly undertake this task. Yeah. And there's another book by Meenakshi Mukherjee, Twice Born Fiction. Yeah. There she, in the preface, she talks about the difficulties that she faced in the beginning when she wanted to work on this body of writing, Indian fiction in English. There were people like wondering, what is there to be done on Indian fiction in English? Can any kind of scholarly work be undertaken on that sort of writing? And in the 1970s, in fact, there were many who even thought that by the end of the 1970s, one would also see the death knell of Indian fiction in English. But quite the reverse happened with the 1980s and Midnight Children and Rushdie happening. That's another story altogether. So, in the next session, this is again, you know, before we move on to the presentations with Kantapura from next week. And please read through Rajmohan's wife, the introduction that Meenakshi Mukherjee gives to the novel. Just about 2 pages. There is a preface by Brajendranath Banerjee. Also, please find out who Brajendranath Banerjee is. That's a 1-page preface that he gives, and a short essay from Perishable Empire, again which Meenakshi Mukherjee writes. So, lot of the critical interventions that we have with respect to Rajmohan's wife, yeah, and it is from Meenakshi Mukherjee, and you will also find that very little scholarly attention has been invested on this work. If you want to take a look at the novel very briefly, you can borrow it from me. You will also see it does not really comply to any of our expectations of a novel. It was serialized initially, then it became a novel. You would find it at times, you know, too long drawn and with lot of descriptions. Yeah. So, but if you want to take a look at it to see how the fiction was written during that time, and again when he starts writing his Bengali novels, it's in a very different way altogether. So, please do read through these works, at least the introduction by Meenakshi Mukherjee. So, that's all for today.